Account of a victim of experiments at Dachau, pain, hope, and justice. They said it was science, progress. But in that cold room with its stained walls and pale lights, all I felt was fear and pain. I tried to scream, I swear I did. But my throat was dry, held in a knot of terror. The sound never came out. They tied me to the gurney as if I were an animal about to be dissected. I felt the leather tighten against my skin, felt their eyes on me. Cold, empty, curious. The pain was slow, meticulous, as if measured in millimeters. Each second there felt like an eternity. And the worst part, I knew it wouldn't be the last time. When you're reduced to a number, a nameless body, you begin to wonder if you're still human. This is my account, and if you dare, I want you to listen to it until the end. Before everything. Before the gurneys, the needles, the stifled screams. I was just a boy trying to live in peace. They called me Elias. I was 26 years old. My hands calloused from working with my father in the bicycle repair shop in southern Germany. My world was small, made of tools, grease, and the smell of heated iron. I loved Sundays, the silence of the streets, the distant sound of church bells, my mother baking bread in the wood-fired oven, my brother reading newspapers aloud, as if he were addressing a packed house. There was love there. There was routine. And even though war was already whispering through the windows, I believed, somewhat naively, that it would never reach us. I remember the day everything changed. It was spring. Flowers were blooming through the cracks in the pavement, and I was thinking about asking Clara to marry me. She smiled with her eyes. She was a teacher, wore light-colored dresses, and gave me books with hidden inscriptions. "For when the world isn't so cruel," she once wrote. I didn't quite understand at the time. Today, I understand all too well. We were warned we were being watched. My father was sympathetic to inappropriate ideas, as they called them. And because I refused to serve the regime, I came to be seen as a threat. But we didn't believe they would do anything. I was just a mechanic. What could I possibly represent to them? The night they arrested me, it was raining. 3 men knocked on the door, wearing soaked uniforms and stone-faced eyes. My mother tried to stop them, but they took all the workshop papers, rummaged through our drawers, and ripped my books from the cabinet. When they handcuffed me, they didn't say why. They just told me not to scream. "It's just an interrogation," they said. I didn't go back. I was thrown into a truck with 6 other men. Most of them I didn't know. One of them was shaking so hard he could barely keep his eyes open. Others wept silently. No one spoke. It was as if, in that cramped, humid space, we already knew we would never be the same again. The journey lasted hours, maybe days. My sense of time vanished with the last glimpse I had of my street, my bedroom window still open, as if waiting for me to return. When we arrived, the iron gate was the first warning. On it, the phrase that still sends shivers down my spine. "Arbeit macht frei." Work sets you free. A lie carved in steel. Echo. I had never heard that name. And yet, I felt a chill run down my spine. Something inside me understood in that instant that I had crossed an invisible border, a line between the world of the living and something worse. They took our clothes, our names, our hair. They gave me a number. 47213. I wrote it down because I knew if I forgot, I would be beaten. I was placed in a cell with 6 other thin, frightened bodies. One whispered that he had been there for 2 years. The other had lost his toes the previous winter. All of them had sunken, distant eyes, as if their souls had already departed. I was still trying to understand what was happening. I mentally replayed the faces of my family, the smell of the workshop, the sound of Clara's bicycle squeaking on the sidewalk. It was my way of resisting. But each day there seemed to erase a piece of who I was. Until the white coats arrived. They didn't beat. They didn't shout. They didn't threaten. I just... Look. They took notes. They whispered to each other. And they chose. One at a time. When they pointed at me for the first time, I still didn't know what it meant. But I felt it. Something told me that that moment was the end of everything I knew. And so the true hell began. They say the worst prison is the one of the mind. Disagree. The worst prison is the one that erases your identity and makes you doubt that you were ever anyone. On my second day at Dachau, I realized that names meant nothing there. One of the guards beat me because I answered Elias when called. He spat on the ground, shoved me to the ground and shouted, "You are 47,213 now. If you forget, you'll bleed until you remember." In that moment, I understood that everything that made me human was being ripped away, layer by layer. Not all at once. They knew how to break someone little by little. They cut my hair until the scalp burned. They gave me a rough uniform, with dirty stripes and a triangle sewn on the chest. I never understood the color code. I only knew mine was red. Political prisoner. An invisible enemy to them. A danger without proof. The block where they placed me smelled of mold, sweat, and dried blood. The beds were wooden planks stacked 3 stories high, with fleas and rats vying for space with the men. We lay shoulder to shoulder. We breathed each other's breath. There were days when one of us wouldn't wake up. Only his silence among the other bodies betrayed death. And yet no one allowed themselves to cry. Tears seemed a dangerous luxury in there. We had schedules. For everything. Waking before the sun, marching in snow or heat, working until our muscles screamed, eating in silence, and sleeping with fear glued to our skin. Anyone who spoke out of turn was beaten. Anyone who walked slowly was beaten. Anyone who coughed too much was taken away. No one came back. The first time I saw a man beaten to death, I vomited. An old man fell during the march. He tried to get up. Kick knocked him down again. Then came the truncheons. 1, 2, 3. I didn't stop counting until I reached 17. Then he stopped moving. The sound of bones breaking remains with me to this day. It echoes when I close my eyes. The days became a blur. My body no longer obeyed me. My knees trembled constantly. Hunger was a constant presence, a dull knife tearing at my insides. I even fought over a piece of stale bread that had fallen to the ground. I, who had previously eaten around the table with my family, now knelt in the mud to chew something not even a dog would accept. But the worst was the silence. Not the silence of the nights. Those were filled with muffled cries and ownerless moans. But the silence of those who survived. A resigned silence of those who no longer believed they would make it out alive. The eyes of the other prisoners said it all. We were buried standing up. We walked like shadows, waiting for the final blow. It was in this scenario that the men in white coats began to circulate through the cells. They weren't wearing uniforms. They looked different. They didn't shout, they didn't hit. They just observed. They chose. They measured. And they wrote on cold clipboards. It was a different kind of cruelty. More sophisticated. More scientific. First, I thought they were there to care for the sick. Foolish hope, I know. But desperation makes us invent fantasies. Until they took the boy from the cell next to mine. His name was Emil. He was only 16 and had a smile on his lips that reminded me of my younger brother. When he returned, if you can even call it returning, he no longer spoke. He trembled. He didn't eat. A week later, they found his body hanging in the bathroom. The torn sheet was pinned to the rafters. The eyes were open but empty. It was then that I realized. Those men in lab coats were more dangerous than the guards. Because they didn't want to kill us. They wanted to use us. I almost preferred direct death. In that camp I stopped being Elias. I stopped being a man. I was now body number 47213. Cold, marked, and ready for what they called a contribution to science. Their science was made of needles, pressure chambers, ice baths, and blood-stained notes. And I still didn't know I was next. They came on a morning when the sky seemed grayer than usual. I remember because the light filtering through the dirty windows barely illuminated the block. The cold cut like a knife even inside the building. One of the guards entered with a piece of paper in his hand. He read some numbers aloud. When he said 47213, my legs simply collapsed. 2 prisoners from the block, men like me forced to cooperate, took me by the arms. They said nothing. They simply avoided my gaze. As if they already knew the fate that awaited me. I was led through corridors I had never seen before. Clean walls, polished floors. They didn't match the rest of the camp. There was silence there. A sterile, clinical silence, as if death itself had been disinfected. We passed through an iron door. And there, everything changed. The room was small, cold. In the center, a metal stretcher with leather straps at the ends. Beside it, trays of instruments. Tweezers, syringes, blades, tubes filled with cloudy liquids. A doctor, or something resembling one, wore a white coat and mask. Behind him, 2 assistants with clipboards. I was laid on the stretcher without resistance. My body obeyed instinctively. One of the assistants began to restrain me. Ankles, wrists, chest. The straps tightened until my skin burned. My heart was racing, my breath coming in short gasps. I tried to ask what they were going to do to me. No one answered. The doctor came closer, touched my arm as if examining an object. Without looking me in the eye, he simply said, "Hold on as long as you can. We'll monitor your reactions." That's when I realized this wasn't treatment. It wasn't care. It was observation. They wanted to see how much longer we could endure. They started with an injection. A cold liquid burned inside as it traveled through the vein. I shivered. My body reacted on its own, uncontrollable tremors racking my legs. An intense heat invaded me, followed by a biting cold. My hands tingled, my vision darkened at the edges. They wrote everything down, with watchful eyes, measuring every contraction, every moan. The doctor turned to the other and said something in technical German that I didn't understand. Then they stuck a tube in my nose, forcing it down my throat. I choked, almost vomited, but they continued. My eyes watered. I tried to scream. Nothing came out. The pain took over everything. At some point I lost track of time. I didn't know if minutes or hours had passed. I only remember the feeling of sinking, as if I were drowning inside. I was running out of oxygen, and the whole world seemed to be slipping away. When they finally released me, my body was drenched in sweat. I couldn't move my arms. I felt liquid running down my leg. I had urinated without realizing it. They didn't say anything. They just threw me back into the wheelchair and pushed me to the cell block. On the way, I passed other prisoners. Their gazes shifted from mine, not out of contempt, but out of fear. They knew I had crossed an invisible line. From that moment on, I was no longer just a prisoner. I was a guinea pig. I returned to the cell in silence. I lay down in the corner. I didn't speak to anyone. My muscles still twitched involuntarily. I felt nauseous, dizzy, cold. But what hurt most was my mind. The certainty that they weren't finished with me. That was just the beginning. That night, I dreamed I was strapped to the stretcher again. But this time no one came. I remained there, alone, eternally tied up. I woke up screaming. Or at least I think I screamed. No one turned around. Maybe they got used to it. Maybe they expected it. From then on, I began counting the days not by the calendar, but by the times they took me. Each visit was a new wound, invisible on the outside, but bleeding on the inside. On the first stretcher I half died. And what was left of me was what they would still use. They called it medical experiments. But I know what it was. It was torture. Cold, calculated, dressed in white coats and clipboards. It was evil disguised as methodology. And we were just the bodies into which they poured their theories. After the first time, everything became easier for them. They knew I was already broken. I no longer reacted. I didn't ask for explanations. I just went whenever my number was called. Weaker and weaker. Emptier and emptier. One of the most brutal tests was hypothermia. They took me to a freezing room, where there was a metal tub filled with water with floating ice chips. They stripped me of my clothes. They left me naked, shivering, while a doctor timed it with a pocket watch. The others just watched. When they lowered me into the water, my body reacted as if I were being electrocuted. My breathing was short, The pain was immediate, sharp, like blades passing under my skin. I lay there, minute after minute. My teeth chattered so hard I thought they would break. My fingers began to stiffen, my vision darkened. They came, touching my chest, checking my eyes, noting the color of my lips. One of the notes I heard, as if it were just some piece of data, was, "Clear signs of peripheral paralysis. Let's wait another 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Felt like an eternity. There was no sense of time there. Only pain. When they finally pulled me out of the water, my body wouldn't react. I had to be carried. They left me naked on an iron table and began to warm me with lamps and blankets. It was another test, measuring how the human body reacts to resuscitation after freezing. My body was no longer my own. It was a living experiment. There were other sessions, low-pressure chambers, where the air was slowly removed, simulating extreme altitudes. Once, I saw a man begin to bleed from his ears, his eyes bulging, trying to scream before passing out. He died right there and no one seemed to care. They just wrote it down. A death was just a negative result. They also tested for drugs. They injected substances without telling me what they were. I felt a burning sensation inside, dizziness, hallucinations. I saw shadows crawling across the walls, heard my mother calling my name. But when I looked to the side, I was just another prisoner raving in silence. The most perverse thing about it all was that the executioners didn't scream. They didn't hit. They acted as if they were in some laboratory. They talked about chemical reactions, cardiac indices, neurological responses. We were numbers, symptoms, variables, nothing more. Over time, I began to forget what it was like to feel without pain. Any touch, any smell, any sound brought back memories of what was happening there. I became a shadow, a momentary survivor. And yet, I felt guilty for being alive while so many others died beside me. There was a day when I sat in the corner of my cell and asked myself, what if I never get out of here? It wasn't a question of fear. It was a question of certainty. I was convinced that death would be the natural end of it all. That my body, one day, would be thrown into the pit with so many others. And that no one would know my name. Only the number. 47,213. But inside me, there was a spark that hadn't yet died. A blind, absurd hope that someone one day would hear my story. That someone somewhere would understand what was done there. Not out of pity, but out of justice. And maybe, just maybe, it was this hope that kept me breathing, even when everything inside me had given up. In the beginning, I prayed every night. I repeated the prayers my mother taught me when I was still a boy. Our Father, Hail Mary, and those words spoken to dispel the fear of the dark. First, they gave me a certain comfort, as if even there, surrounded by pain and death, God could still hear me. But over time, the silence grew too loud. No matter how much I prayed, the screams wouldn't stop. The moans, the muffled sounds of blows, the bodies being dragged through the night. None of it diminished. And God seemed increasingly distant, absent, blind. I began to doubt. Little by little, I stopped talking to him. First out of anger, then out of shame, and finally out of simple exhaustion. My words no longer held any power. My thoughts were confused, jumbled. I no longer knew if it was day or night, winter or summer. The clocks of my mind had stopped, frozen the moment I first stepped onto that field. The fear of going mad was taking up space where faith had once been. I saw things that might have been there, or might not. A figure passing too quickly, a whisper coming from nowhere, a familiar face among the other bodies. And then it disappeared. Once, I swore I saw my mother at the block window. She was there, standing there, in that apron she wore on Sundays, smiling at me. I smiled back like a child. But when I blinked, it was just a shadow cast by the light. At those times I felt a different cold. Not the cold of snow, nor the cold water in experiments, but the cold that comes from within, when the mind begins to slowly slip into a place of no return. That point where pain is no longer enough to prove one is alive. There was a man in my cell, His name was Abram. Old, silent. His eyes always closed as if he were sleeping. One day, he told me something I've never forgotten. The camp doesn't just want our bodies. It wants our souls. And when they leave, they don't come back. I understood what he meant the day I heard a prisoner start laughing during an execution. It wasn't a nervous laugh, nor a desperate one. It was a free laugh, as if he were witnessing a joke only he understood. After that, he spent his days staring at the wall, mumbling nonsense. He was taken away the following week. He never returned. Madness stalked each of us like a starving dog. Sometimes it attacked suddenly. Other times it waited patiently. But sooner or later it bit. I remember one night waking up with the feeling of suffocation. There was no one above me, no weight on my chest. It was the very air that seemed to betray me. I staggered to my feet, banging my head against the wall, trying to wake myself up. I thought, what if I'm already dead and just haven't realized it? Yes, the fear of going mad was constant. But there was something even worse. The fear of getting used to it. I was afraid of becoming indifferent, of seeing someone die beside me and feeling nothing, of looking in the mirror, if there was one, and no longer recognizing my own eyes, of forgetting the sound of my mother's voice, the smell of home-brewed coffee, the touch of Clara's hand. And that, for me, was the true end. Because as long as I remembered, as long as there was pain, as long as something inside me still revolted against that horror, I was still human. So, even when I stopped praying, even when I no longer felt God, even when my body was just a shell, something inside me insisted on not surrendering. Maybe that's what saved me. Or maybe that's exactly what bothered them. I always imagined that if freedom ever returned, it would come like a flash, like a scream piercing my chest, like an explosion of tears and hugs. I thought we'd hear the gates open and rush out, tripping over each other, laughing, crying, shouting our names to the sky. But it wasn't like that. The truth is, the day of liberation was as silent as an execution. We woke to a different sound. Hurried footsteps, voices in German more tense than usual. The guards seemed nervous. Some were running. Others were burning papers. Smoke was coming from one of the offices. It was strange to see fear in their eyes. For the first time it seemed they knew time was up. No one said anything to us. We only felt their absence. Suddenly the screams stopped. The dogs fell silent. The gunshots faded. A few hours later, soldiers appeared. But they weren't like the ones we were used to seeing. They were different. Dirty, their uniforms bearing symbols we didn't immediately recognize. One of them cried when he saw us. He took off his helmet and looked at me as if he'd seen a ghost. "My God," was all he said. That's when I understood. They didn't know. They didn't know what had happened inside. No one knew. And that scared me more than anything. They took us out one by one. I was so weak I had to be carried. I remember the wind in my face, the sky above, so blue, so normal. The same sky that had been there all along, while we slowly died behind the walls. But no one ran. No one smiled. 'Cause we no longer knew how. We walked slowly, as if each step were a reminder of those left behind. The bodies rotted in the barracks. Clothes hung from their bones. Some of the liberators vomited. Others knelt. But we just watched. I sat near the barbed wire fence and looked out at the empty fields. The towers were deserted. The Reich flag had been torn down. And now a makeshift tarp with the Allied symbol fluttered. But for me it was still Dachau. It was still the prison where my soul was broken. When they gave me a blanket and some soup I cried. Not because of the gesture, but because my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't hold the spoon. A soldier tried to help. I touched his hand and cringed like a wounded animal. My body no longer knew what affection was. In the days that followed, we were taken to triage centers. Doctors, journalists, social workers. Everyone wanted to know. But no one really listened. The questions came like knives. Were you tortured? Did you witness deaths? Did you participate in experiments? Yes. But how to explain? How to put into words what even my mind couldn't organize? I began to understand that, although the gates had opened, the camp still lived within me. The freedom I dreamed of for so long was a strange space, too vast for someone who spent years surrounded by wire and pain. The scariest thing about freedom was realizing I no longer knew what to do with it. Walking the streets again, looking at shop windows, hearing laughter. It all seemed like a farce. I felt like a shadow walking among the living. The world had moved on. I was trapped in a time no one wanted to remember. And that's when I understood. Dachau wasn't over. Not for me. It existed in nightmares, in averted glances, in the silence of conversations, in the pain that never left me. Liberation wasn't an end. It was the beginning of another kind of struggle. That of trying to live after having already died inside. No one prepared us for what came after. Everyone talked about the horrors of the camps, the experiments, the deaths, the liberation. But no one talked about what came after that. About what happens to a body that survives but carries a cemetery within. Liberation didn't bring relief. It brought strangeness. It was like waking from a nightmare and discovering that the real world also made no sense. I was free, but free for what? They housed us in a makeshift refugee camp, with beds, food, and clean blankets. There were doctors examining us, journalists taking photos, volunteers trying to cheer us up with forced smiles. But it all felt staged. I looked around and saw other men like me. Empty eyes, hunched backs, trembling hands. Survivors who had left pieces of themselves in the cold rooms of Dachau. The nights were unbearable. I closed my eyes and felt the leather straps tightening around my wrists. I smelled the acid, the burning flesh, the fear of the other prisoners. I woke drenched in sweat, with screams stuck in my throat. Once I tried sleeping with a light on. I thought it would help. It only got worse. The shadows on the walls began to move. I saw figures, heard footsteps. I felt someone watching me constantly. During the day, I avoided mirrors. I no longer recognized the man staring back at me. Thin, pale. His ribs protruding from his skin. But the worst part wasn't his body, it was his gaze. A gaze without light, without direction, without hope. I tried to write letters. To my family. Clara. But the pen trembled in my hand, and the words escaped me. What was I going to say? How could I tell them that I was no longer the Elias they knew? How could I explain that, even in freedom, I still heard screams every time I closed my eyes? Some returned to their hometowns. Others emigrated. I wandered for a while, not knowing where to go. Not knowing if there was anywhere to return. Because to me, the world outside seemed like a fragile theater, built on an abyss. Everyone was smiling, talking about reconstruction, about the future. But no one wanted to hear about the past. Talking about what happened was like tearing my own skin. And the silence often seemed crueler than anything I had experienced in the camp. Because at least there, the pain was visible. Out here it was invisible, ignored, uncomfortable. Some days I thought about disappearing. I would walk to the riverbank, sit for hours watching the current. I thought about how simple it would be to just slip away. Let the water carry away what was left of me. But there was always something stopping me. Memory, voice, a name whispered inside my head. I survived the camp, but the camp survived inside me. Today I walk the streets and see the world remade. Children running, shops open, music in the cafes. And I wonder, does any of them know what was done in the name of science? Does anyone still care? Trauma isn't just what we experience. It's what stays with us when everything seems to have returned to normal. Carry Dachau in my bones, in my nightmares, in my labored breath when I hear a door slam shut too hard, in the trembling of my hand when I see needles, in the silence between one sentence and the next. Surviving wasn't the end of the pain. It was the beginning. For a long time I believed the world had forgotten us. The years passed, and with them came silence. The newspapers stopped talking about the camps. People smiled again in the streets, rebuilt their homes, rebuilt their cities, and buried, along with the rubble, the memories of what they experienced, or allowed to happen. But I couldn't forget. Couldn't. Every scar on my body was a reminder of what they did to me in the name of science. I was a number, an experiment, a human guinea pig locked in freezing rooms where men in lab coats wrote on clipboards while I screamed. And now? Where were they now? Many of those doctors, guards, commanders escaped. They changed their names. They lived their lives far from the eyes of justice. Some even returned to practicing medicine. One of them, the one who injected substances into my brain as if I were a lab rat, appeared in an article years later, as a respected researcher. I spat on the floor when I read it. The wound reopened, and it hurt, not just for me, but for all those who didn't survive to tell the story. It was then that I decided my pain wouldn't be in vain. I began to write, in pieces, on loose sheets, sometimes in the early hours of the morning, trembling, crying, reliving every second. It was like ripping off living flesh. But I had to. It was either that or go mad. My testimony was included in a trial years later. A prosecutor insisted on gathering evidence against a group of Nazi doctors. I was called to testify. The first time I entered a courtroom, my hand shook like it had that morning when I received soup from an Allied soldier. But I spoke. And when I finished, the silence in the room was heavier than that of any cell. They listened. For the first time they listened. And some of them paid. Few. Very few. But when I heard the sentence read aloud, I felt something inside me break. It wasn't relief. It was a kind of sad justice. Delayed, but real. I saw mothers crying. I saw former comrades in arms hugging each other. I saw reporters trying to make sense of it all as if it were a movie. But for me, it was just another chapter in a nightmare that never ended. Still that night I slept better. I continued attending meetings, conferences, memorials. I told my story to anyone who would listen, and to anyone who wouldn't too. Because the truth needed to survive, even if many tried to bury it. Justice, I discovered, isn't just about punishing. It's about remembering. It's about looking history in the eye and saying, "We saw what you did." And even if many still try to deny, hide, or soften it, there are voices like mine, wounded but firm, that continue to echo. Hope. It was never complete, but it endured, even within cold walls, even amidst muffled screams. Survived. It survived within me. And in every word you now hear, I've already told my story. I've already revealed what the men in white coats did to me, to so many others. The pain I carried, the fears I faced, the hope that stubbornly wouldn't fade. But I know that words like mine, even fraught with suffering, are just fragments. Fragments of a past that insists on trying to hide itself. That's why I speak. I speak so that no one forgets. To forget is to allow horror to repeat itself. To forget is to betray those who died in silence, chained not only by bars, but by indifference. To forget is to allow evil to rise again disguised as normality. I see the eyes of young people today. I see in them the flame of curiosity, of life that beats strongly. It is for you that I leave this account, so that you may know that justice is not a straight line, that hope may be small, but it does not die, and that the truth, even when hidden, always finds its way. I survived Dachau. I survived the experiments. I survived the torture. But I didn't just survive, I chose to fight. To fight for the story to be told. For the voices that were silenced to be heard. For the shadows of the past to illuminate the present. If you are watching this account, I ask you to do more than listen. I ask you to share. I ask you to ask questions. I ask you not to let silence dominate. Memory is an act of resistance. Every subscription to this channel, every like, every comment is a step toward keeping this flame alive. So that the world knows that yesterday's pain was not in vain. That the fight for justice continues. I am not just a number. I am not just a survivor. I am a voice. And this voice is yours too now. May my story serve to ensure that it never happens again. May the pain of so many not be forgotten. And may the hope I carried, even in the worst moments, inspire others to never give up. If you want to hear more stories, Stories that official history tries to erase. Subscribe. Join us, because the fight for memory is a fight for all of us. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And remember, justice may be delayed, but it cannot be silenced.